Hello guys, this is sPzAbt. In today's video, we are going to be continuing on with the Tiger 1 from the 506 sPzAbt. In today's video specifically, we're going to be working on the engine deck. This is an area where we can have a lot of fun with different effects, and we're going to look at some things like a new way I figured out to make some fuel stains, which I think came out pretty cool. We will also look at how to make some spilled coolant effects, as well as the grease and oil that we expect everywhere on the engine deck itself. I'm also going to show you how to use some glossy effects to make this stuff stand out from the matte finish of the tank. Of course, these effects are not limited to the engine deck. There are a whole bunch of different areas in the tank we will look at as well. These areas all benefit from similar effects, be it wet effects, grease, or even the mud effects in the lower areas of the tank. I do hope you enjoy the video. Now let's get started. Since the end of the last video in which I applied the dust effects to this tank, I have given it the final coat of matte varnish. I'm not going to apply one afterwards. This is my final coat here, which is Tester's Dull Coat, which is the best stuff. And I applied it now because some of the effects we're going to be applying today, such as both of these enamel effects I'm showing you now, these have glossy sheens to them, and I want that glossiness to remain. If I were to apply the matte coat afterwards, the nice shininess of these effects, which you can see for example on the Panzer III here, that shininess would be erased because the matte varnish would kill the gloss. These are the products I'm going to be using to make some fuel stain effects. These are acrylics, and I suppose you could also use enamels of the same color, for example these ones here, but I'm not exactly sure about that because these are enamel effects and therefore they require enamel thinner to blend them. That's going to be a problem because those glossy effects I want to apply afterwards, for example this one here, they are also enamel based. So if I were to blend the glossy effects with this thinner, it would also remove or damage these previous effects. However, if I were to use acrylics for the first layer, they are not affected by enamel thinner because they are not enamels, they're acrylics, so they use just simply tap water. Therefore, it is safe to apply this and blend it on top afterwards. Hopefully that's not too confusing, but basically just don't put enamels over enamels, put enamels over acrylics. These are the acrylics I've chosen. They're Wilder Aqualines. They're technically gouache paints. And I've got a few different colors here. They might look like rust, but we're actually going to use them for fuel stains. I've got some tap water in a cup. This is for blending the effects. And I have a small AK Interactive brush here, 3/0 round. We're going to use this to apply everything you see in the video today. Now if you look at the engine deck on the Tiger, there are these 4 Phillips head screws cap things. Now looking at the instructions in the kit, we can figure out what they're for. If you look closely here, this one is the fuel tank, I believe, and then this one back here is connected to the radiators and the fans and all that stuff. So I'm pretty sure that's coolant. So again, I'm going to go with the one at the front here is the fuel, and the one at the back is the coolant. If you look at the Wilder Aqualine, it's very, very thick in the bottle because it's basically pure gouache paint. So I'm going to thin it down with some tap water. I'm going to begin by applying the orange rusty color in the general area where I want the fuel stains. Again, these are the caps further forward on the tank. I studied a couple of photos of fuel stains, and I noticed they have this weird orangish color, which is what happens to when the fuel mixes with the dust or whatever. I thought it was pretty cool, so I decided to try out making it. Here you can also see that I'm wiping away any excess with water. Easy way to wipe away stuff you don't like. Now I'm going to get some of the darker color and apply it closer to the cap. So this is like the darker, more fresh stuff. Then I'm going to get a little bit of tap water on my brush, and I can actually blend them together and sort of just feather the edges because I don't want this hard transition. That looks pretty bad. I wanted it to like subtly go from darker to lighter. So I can just gently stipple at the edge when it's all still wet with a little bit of water, and it'll kind of diffuse together. Now I'm getting some of the lighter color, and I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to apply this further away for the more dry stuff. This is like the dust that's kind of collected at the edge. Again, feathering it with some water here. Then I went back over with some more orange. Then I went back over with some more of the dusty color. And like I said, this is my first time doing this effect, so it took a little bit of trial and error and a few different layers. But it didn't take too long, honestly, and I do think the results actually look pretty good. This is a new effect for me, but I do think it looks pretty convincing given the reference photos I had on hand. And, you know, they don't look too stand out, like they kind of blend with the rest of the tank, so they don't look crazy. And then when you put the turret on, you can't really see them anyways, so what's the point, right? Now let's move on to the main oily and greasy effects in the rest of the tank. I'm going to mainly be using the MiG Productions engine grime effect you can see here. This has a slightly satin finish when it dries. I also have Wilder Murky Water Wet effect for even more glossy areas. Both of these effects are enamel based, so I'm going to use some Wilder enamel thinner to blend them. That's why we used acrylics beforehand, because I don't want that thinner to damage the previous effects. I thin it down a little bit, but honestly not that much. You can probably use it straight from the bottle. I begin to apply it in a couple of areas where I figure, you know, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff collected in these areas. Grease, oil, anything. Tanks are pretty messy in real life. I think that the glossiness and the greasiness of tanks is often underrepresented on scale models. I can safely apply this effect over top of my fuel stains from before to make them just have a little bit more layering to the effect. And I'm also applying some more of it around here because why not, right? A few other areas can also benefit from this effect. We'll look at that more later. Now I'm going to grab some Wilder enamel thinner on my brush, just a little bit. I want the brush to be damp, not soaked or loaded with the thinner, just a little bit. And I can now begin to blend out the edges of my quite messy application. You can see here that it's just kind of like hard edges right now. I don't want that. I want it to be a little bit more feathered, kind of like what we were doing with the fuel stains before. So I can just nudge at the edges there and get a little bit of thinner on my brush and just kind of smooth it out. Here I'm going back with a second layer of the MiG Productions engine grime effect, just to darken it up and do a couple of touch-ups. And I figured there were a couple of other areas where this effect would look good, so I did a couple of spots on the vents in a few areas, because I didn't think it was messy enough. So always make it more messy. Now at this point I decided to add a little bit more dust to the engine deck, so I'm going to use the Wilder Aqualine product we looked at before. And I'm going to apply it in a couple of edges here. Again, I'm choosing an acrylic because I can blend this easily with water and I don't risk damaging the previous enamels on there because water won't damage the enamels. So I've got a slightly damp brush here with water again. I'm just rubbing at the edges to feather it and blend it out. Same thing we were doing before with those fuel stains. But now I'm just doing it with a single color to simulate some dust. I also decided to simulate maybe the coolant had spilled out a little bit, and since it's maybe sticky or wet or whatever, the dust had kind of stuck to it but hadn't discolored, because what we did for the fuel stains is basically the same thing, but it's supposed to be discolored because of the color of the fuel. This is more of a just pure sand kind of effect, or sand or dust or whatever it is. And I mean, this I wasn't exactly too sure about, but I did lots of blending at the edges later on, kind of like what you saw before there, which is blending the edges on the engine deck, and it actually came out looking pretty subtle and nice, so I am happy with the result. But I'm just being kind of fancy here with all my different effects basically. Alright, the next step here is to apply the even glossier effects. So I'm going to use the Murky Water Nitroline effect I showed you just 2 minutes ago. And again, it's an enamel, so it has to be blended with enamel thinner, so I'm going to use the Wilder stuff that goes with it. This stuff is very, very thick in the bottle. It's almost like a varnish, so I have to thin it at least 50% with Wilder enamel thinner. I now start to apply this effect over some of the areas where I previously applied the engine grime, but not all of them. The reason for that is, as we'll see later, the engine grime itself has a slightly shiny finish to it, but when you apply this over top of it, it gets even more shiny. So I can simulate more fresh areas that are more wet by applying this over top of them. But if I want some effects to look a little bit less fresh, but they're still like a little bit sticky because they're oily, of course, I can just leave them with the finish they have now from the engine grime, and that way we'll have kind of differences in the shininess on certain areas. I can also just apply the glossy effect over the paint, like here, and it kind of gives a similar effect where you just have kind of a wet area, but it's not exactly oil or fuel, it's just kind of like just wetness. I don't know, could be anything, but it looks cool. I got rid of this area of fuel stain because I just didn't like it, but I can easily wipe it away with water, and I don't damage the surrounding effects because they're mostly enamels. And now I'm going to apply some more of the murky water gloss effect over top of that, and also a couple little areas around it just to make it look like there's little drips of oil or anything else on the engine deck there. The murky water effect was not only applied on the engine deck, I also went around a couple of different areas in the tank and applied some glossy effects there as well. A good spot for that is all the areas where we have this built up mud and dust that we kind of laid out a little bit at the beginning of last week's video. So we're going to do some more mud effects later, of course, mostly focusing on the lower hull, but there's a little bit kicked up on the fenders here. I can make it look pretty cool by accentuating some of those brown streaks with this gloss to make them look even more fresh. I chose a few other areas in the tank where there were some muddy and greasy areas, so areas where the crew walks, and also a little bit around the tools and the tow cables and stuff. And I picked out a few spots to apply this effect. Not everywhere. I'm trying to keep it kind of subtle, but you can pick a few areas that are most heavily used, and you can accentuate the previous effects that you've made with the dark oil paints like we saw in last week's video, or you can just pick random areas that don't have any dark areas on them, and this just looks like maybe water then, rather than mud or grease. If you're looking for another area on the tank to apply some greasy effects, well, the gun is a good choice. Also, since I was never finished with these fuel stains, I did something that I do a lot when I want to blend stuff out. I picked this MIG Productions dry mud pigment. If you can see on the bottom, it's basically Dunkelgelb colored. So what I do is I just take a little bit of it on my brush and apply a thin, kind of like dusty pass over areas that stand out too much. This just gives them a slightly toned down and more Dunkelgelb look, which makes them blend better with the finish of the tank. And there we go. We've completed the engine deck and other wet effects on the tank. Now, I think this came out actually really awesome. I tried a couple of new things here, and I think it paid off. These fuel stains were definitely something new. Beforehand, I would have just used the same engine grease effect, but I think what I did here with a couple of different colors, it was a risk, but I do think it paid off. I think that looks awesome. And also the coolant stains, they're kind of like, I think they're alright. Maybe I should try something else next time, but I still think they kind of convey the look that I wanted there, caked on dust. And of course we also have the nice engine grease and glossy effects we applied here. And now here I can show you a good example of the difference between the gloss and the satin finish. So here's an area where we applied the gloss over top of the fuel stain. You can see it's very shiny. That looks more fresh. Now this area to the side here, this is just the pure engine grime, and you can see it has a little bit of a glossiness to it. It's kind of like satin or semi-gloss. So that looks like a little bit of an older stain maybe. And of course there's a few other areas where we applied it. I didn't show every single one in the video, but there's a little bit around these vents in the back that can fold up. You know, there's some kind of around the turret where the crew might walk, or just around the turret ring because I imagine that's pretty greasy. Around the tow cables is also a good example because I imagine they're also kind of messy because they're on the tracks on the ground and everything like that. And of course, all these areas where we have some nice shine now, accentuating the mud and dirt streaks we applied very subtly in last week's video with some oil paints. I think this also looks really, really awesome and really makes these streaks stand out. As I stressed before, don't apply the gloss over every single dark area of grease or mud on your tank. You want some areas to look dark and dry. You also want some areas to look wet, but don't make everything look wet, otherwise it's going to be too much. You can see on the turret here, there's a few wet areas around the areas that are most heavily worn, like next to the hatches and also near that grenade launcher, which rotates, so I imagine it's kind of greasy. Keep it subtle. Some of this is grease, some of this is water, but most importantly, there is not a lot of this effect. Otherwise, it gets overpowering. As with most effects, it can be easily overdone, so apply a little bit, take a step back, and think, is this enough? Anyways, that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, post them below. I always read through them all. And make sure you go check out the nice Tiger 1 over on Martin's channel, Night Shift. He's doing an excellent job with his own Tiger 1. I think this week he's going to give you guys some dust effects like I showed last week on this Tiger here. Also, big thanks to my Patreon supporters. Those guys really help me out making these videos. If you can support me, go over there and help. It's much appreciated. Anyways, I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye and happy modeling.